3 words. That's all it took. I stared at my phone, at the preview of a text from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words glowing against the screen at 6:47 in the morning. She's having it. I looked at Harry, at the man I'd married 5 years ago, at the man who'd held my hand at my father's funeral and whispered that he'd never let anything hurt me. 6 years I'd given him, and he'd spent them preparing my replacement. I slid out of bed without making a sound. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why I didn't wake him, didn't scream, didn't do any of the things a betrayed wife is supposed to do, you need to understand what I'd already survived and what I'd been quietly building while everyone thought I was broken. My name is Brenda Whitmore, 34 years old, chief strategist of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, a boutique hotel empire my father had built from a single inn in Charleston. Still married, at least on paper, but I understand now that I'd never really been a wife. I'd been an acquisition. 6 years earlier, I was a different woman. I was 28 when my father died. Robert Whitmore, Bobby to everyone who knew him, had built the Whitmore Hospitality Group over 30 years, growing it from a single bed and breakfast on the Charleston waterfront to a collection of 12 boutique properties across the Southeast. Not the biggest chain, not the flashiest, but respected, profitable, and entirely his. When the heart attack took him, it took something from me too. I'd been groomed to run the company since I was old enough to fold napkins in the dining room. But grief has a way of making even the strongest people doubt themselves. And in those first months after the funeral, I doubted everything. That's when Margaret Thornton appeared. Margaret was old Charleston money. She'd known Bobby from the tourism board, from charity galas, from the small world where hospitality executives and real estate developers circled each other like sharks in evening wear. She arrived at my door 3 weeks after the funeral with a casserole and condolences and a suggestion. Her son, Harry, was looking to transition out of commercial real estate in Atlanta. He understood the hospitality industry. He admired what Bobby had built. And he was, Margaret mentioned casually, recently single. I should have seen it then, the precision of the timing, the convenience of the introduction. But grief makes people hungry for comfort, and Harry Thornton knew exactly how to provide it. He was 40 years old, tall, with the kind of confident ease that came from never having been told no. He didn't talk to me about my father's death the way everyone else did, with that careful, pitying tone that made me feel like a child. He talked to me about the company, about my vision for it, about the expansion opportunities I'd been sketching out for years. He made me feel seen, capable, not like a grieving daughter, but like a businesswoman with a future. We were engaged within the year. Looking back, I can trace exactly how it happened, how Harry positioned himself as indispensable, how Margaret became a constant presence at family dinners, company events, board meetings, how the suggestions started small, maybe Harry should sit in on the financial reviews, just to offer a fresh perspective, and grew larger until suddenly he had an office at headquarters and a title I didn't remember approving. I'd been so focused on proving I could run my father's company that I hadn't noticed someone else was already running me. There was one person who'd tried to warn me. My uncle, Richard Whitmore, had called after the engagement was announced. Richard was Bobby's older brother, a billionaire who'd made his fortune in Dallas real estate and energy, while Bobby built his quieter empire in Charleston. The brothers had been close ones, but something had driven them apart in their 40s, and by the time Bobby died, they hadn't spoken in years. Richard's call was brief. "Congratulations on the engagement," he'd said. Then a pause. And then, "Bobby always said you were the smart one. Make sure you stay that way." I dismissed it as the cryptic mutterings of an estranged uncle, but I'd never forgotten it. Richard still held 15% of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, a stake he'd bought decades ago as a favor to his brother and never sold. He never attended board meetings, never interfered, just collected his dividends and watched from a distance. I'd always wondered what he was watching for. Now, 6 years into a marriage that had slowly revealed itself to be a hostile takeover, I was beginning to understand. The signs had been there all along if I'd known how to read them. The way Harry always deferred to Margaret's opinion on social matters, the way he subtly redirected conversations away from my strategic ideas and toward his own operational concerns. the way he'd positioned himself as the face of the company at industry events while I stayed behind the scenes, focusing on the work. I thought I was being a team player. I thought we were building something together. I'd been wrong. What happened next would change everything. The first time I truly saw Harry for what he was, it was almost too late. A business dinner with potential partners from a hotel chain out of Miami. I'd prepared for weeks, projections, market analysis, a proposal that would double the company's footprint in Florida within 3 years. But when the meeting started, Harry took over. He presented my ideas as if they were his own. He fielded questions I should have answered. And when I tried to interject, he smiled at me. That same smile that had once made me feel safe, and said, "Let's not overwhelm them with details, sweetheart." Sweetheart, in a business meeting, in front of potential partners. The Miami executives looked uncomfortable. One of them, a woman about my age, caught my eye with something like sympathy or recognition. That night, I lay awake in bed while Harry snored beside me, and I finally allowed myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding for years. What if he never loved me? What if it was always about the company? I'd pushed the thought away then, but it had never really left. It started with the accounts. Harry suggested we consolidate our finances about a year into the marriage. It made sense, he said. We were partners in life and business. Why maintain separate accounts when we were building something together? I agreed. I'd been raised to trust my husband. My parents had shared everything, finances, decisions, the weight of building a company from nothing. I thought I was honoring that legacy. I didn't realize I was handing over the keys to my own cage. The changes were gradual. First, Harry took over paying the household bills to free up my time for company strategy, he said. Then he suggested moving my personal savings into a joint investment account he'd set up with our financial advisor. Then my credit card started having issues. Declined at a restaurant, flagged at a department store, always some technical glitch that Harry would handle with a phone call and an apologetic smile. I didn't think to check the limits until I couldn't book a flight to visit an old college friend without asking Harry to approve the charge. By then, I'd been married for 3 years. The company's finances were even more opaque. Harry had positioned himself as the bridge between my strategic vision and the operational reality. He attended every meeting with the CFO. He reviewed every capital allocation. He signed off on every major expense. When I asked to see the quarterly reports directly, he'd provide them, but always with his annotations, his summaries, his interpretation of what the numbers meant. Marcus Chen had worked for my father for 18 years. He was the comptroller, not the CFO, but the man who actually knew where every dollar went. He taught me to read a balance sheet when I was 16, and he was the first person to tell me something was wrong. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late March. Harry was in Atlanta for a conference. Marcus appeared at my office door with a folder and a look I'd never seen on his face before. Concern. Real concern. He didn't say much, just handed me the folder and told me to look at the disbursements from the past 18 months, specifically the ones routed through a subsidiary LLC that Harry had created to manage renovation costs. The numbers didn't add up. Money was moving out of the company, significant amounts, 6 and 7 figures, into accounts that Marcus couldn't trace. The paperwork was immaculate. Every transfer had documentation, but the documentation led to shell companies, and the shell companies led to nothing. Someone was bleeding the company dry, and they were doing it carefully enough that only someone who'd spent 2 decades studying its financial heartbeat would notice. Marcus looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said Harry's name. We didn't have to. That decision would cost him everything. I didn't confront him, not yet. I needed to see how deep the hole went. The next few weeks, I played the role of the oblivious wife. I smiled at Harry across the breakfast table. I asked about his day. I let him kiss my forehead before bed as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Marcus started bringing me files every Thursday afternoon when Harry was reliably occupied with his investment meetings in Atlanta. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Harry wasn't just skimming, he was systematically extracting capital from every part of the company he could access. There was a renovation fund for the Charleston flagship property, $2.1 million approved by the board for upgrades that had never been completed. The contractors had been paid, according to the paperwork, but Marcus had called them. Most had never heard of the project. There was a consulting retainer paid to a firm in Nevada that didn't appear to have any employees, any office, or any record of providing actual consulting services. $75,000 a month, going back 14 months. That's over $1 million for nothing. And then there was the Arizona LLC. Marcus had finally traced the ownership, layer after layer of corporate shell games, but he'd found a thread and followed it. The LLC owned a single asset, a property in Sedona valued at just over $4.2 million, a boutique wellness retreat that was scheduled to open in the spring. The property was titled to Ann Martinez. The funding had come from Harry's shell companies, and the business plan Marcus had obtained showed projections for the next 5 years, projections that assumed a significant capital injection right around the time Harry's divorce from me was expected to finalize. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was using my father's company to finance his future with another woman. He thought he'd won. He was wrong. Margaret was the architect of my social exile. It wasn't obvious at first. Margaret was always so helpful, so present. She organized the dinner parties, managed the guest lists, handled the RSVPs. She was just trying to take things off my plate, she said, give me more time to focus on the business. But I started noticing patterns. Old friends stopped being invited to events. Colleagues who'd known my father were quietly shuffled to the edges of conversations. Board members who'd once sought my opinion now directed their questions to Harry, while Margaret hovered nearby with that thin smile that never reached her eyes. The charity gala for the Charleston Children's Hospital was the night I understood what was happening. I'd been on the planning committee for 5 years. It was one of my mother's causes before she passed, and I'd continued it in her memory. But that year, I arrived at the venue to find my seat had been moved. I was no longer at the head table with the major donors. I was tucked in a corner next to the emergency exit, with a clear view of Margaret holding court where I should have been. When I asked about the change, the event coordinator looked confused. She said Mrs. Thornton had mentioned I preferred to be out of the spotlight this year, something about the stress of the company restructuring. I hadn't said anything of the sort, and there was no restructuring. Not yet, anyway. My friend Diane tried to warn me. We'd known each other since graduate school, and Diane had never liked Harry. Too polished, she said, too eager to agree with everything I said. We met for lunch at a cafe outside the city, away from Margaret's network of eyes and ears. Diane told me what she'd heard through the Charleston rumor mill, that Harry was telling people I was struggling, that the stress of running my father's company was taking a toll, that I was becoming erratic, paranoid. I drove home in a daze. That night, Harry found me sitting in the dark in the living room. He asked what was wrong. I told him about the lunch with Diane, about the rumors. He didn't get defensive, didn't raise his voice. He just sat down across from me and spoke in that calm, reasonable tone he always used when he wanted me to feel like I was overreacting. Diane had always been jealous of my success, he said. She was probably just stirring up drama because her own marriage was falling apart. And as for the rumors, well, people talked. That was just how Charleston society worked. The best thing I could do was ignore it, focus on my work, let him handle the social side. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that came before storms. He was building walls around me, and he thought I was letting him. The isolation extended beyond social events. I started noticing how my phone seemed to lose messages. Important emails went to spam. Meeting invitations arrived after the meetings had already happened. Harry always had an explanation. Technology was unreliable. People were forgetful. I was probably just stressed and missing things. But I wasn't missing things. I was finally seeing them. There was a pattern to who got pushed out of my life. Anyone who might question Harry's version of events. Anyone who remembered me as the competent, confident woman I'd been before my father died. Anyone who might notice that the Brenda who existed now, quiet, deferential, always a step behind her husband, wasn't the real me at all. I tested it one afternoon, sent an email to 3 board members requesting individual meetings to discuss strategic planning. Nothing controversial, nothing that should raise any alarms. None of them responded directly. Instead, Harry mentioned casually at dinner that he'd heard I was reaching out to board members and wondered if everything was okay. He suggested maybe he should handle board communications for a while, just until things settled down. I agreed, of course. I was always agreeing now. It was part of the plan. But that night, I added their names to a list. Board members who reported to Harry instead of responding to me. People I'd need to work around when the time came. The trap was closing, but for the first time in years, I knew exactly where the walls were. And that's when I made my decision. I found the first evidence on a Tuesday in September. Harry had left his tablet on the kitchen counter. He never did that. He was careful with his devices, always locking screens, always logging out, always making sure nothing was left where I might accidentally see it. But that morning, he'd been in a rush. A conference call with investors in New York had started earlier than expected, and he'd grabbed his laptop and sprinted to his office without his usual security sweep. The tablet pinged with a notification. I glanced at it. I wasn't looking for anything, I was just reaching for my coffee, and the screen lit up, and there it was. A message from someone named Anne. The preview showed only the first few words. I can't stop thinking about last weekend. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there, coffee cup halfway to my lips, staring at the screen. The words seemed to rearrange themselves as I read them. Surely they meant something else. Surely there was an explanation. I set down the coffee, I picked up the tablet. I swiped. The passcode screen appeared. 4 digits. I tried Harry's birthday. Wrong. His mother's birthday. Wrong. Our anniversary. Wrong. I tried the date of my father's death. The tablet unlocked. My jaw ached from how hard I was clenching it. The messages went back 7 months. They weren't explicit, nothing that would hold up in a divorce proceeding as proof of infidelity, but they were worse than explicit. They were intimate. Anne talked about the future, about when things are settled, about our plans. She mentioned a property in Sedona, a boutique wellness retreat she was developing. She thanked Harry for believing in her vision, for his investment, for everything he was making possible. I scrolled through the messages with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a wound. I didn't cry, I didn't break anything. I just read and cataloged and understood. Anne Martinez, 31 years old, former hospitality manager who'd somehow acquired enough capital to purchase a luxury property in one of Arizona's most expensive markets. The funding had come from somewhere, and now I knew where. I put the tablet back exactly where I'd found it. I finished my coffee, I went to work. I didn't tell Harry what I'd seen. Not yet. That's when I understood. I wasn't being cheated on, I was being phased out. She didn't know it yet, but someone was watching. I spent the next week learning everything I could about Anne Martinez. Social media told part of the story. Anne was careful about what she posted, but not careful enough. There were photos from industry conferences where Harry had also been present. A tagged location at a resort in Cabo San Lucas for a weekend Harry had claimed to be in Houston. A congratulatory comment from Margaret, who supposedly didn't know this woman existed, on a post about Anne's exciting new venture. But there was something else I discovered, something that reframed everything. Anne Martinez had declared bankruptcy 3 years ago. Her credit had been destroyed. There was no way she could have secured financing for a $4.2 million property through any legitimate channel. The money had to come from somewhere, and now I knew exactly where. Harry had taken the capital he was bleeding from the Whitmore Hospitality Group and invested it in his mistress's dream. He'd used my inheritance to build a future with another woman. Every dollar that went missing from the company was a dollar that went toward a property that would belong to Anne, a property titled in her name, protected from any divorce proceedings, funded entirely with stolen money. The cruelty of it made my hands shake, but the stupidity of it gave me hope. Harry had created a paper trail. He'd been careful, but not careful enough. The same documents that proved his theft would prove Anne's involvement, and that meant leverage. The worst part? This was only the beginning. The medical invoice arrived in October. It was buried in a stack of statements that Harry usually intercepted, but the mail came early that day, and I happened to be home. A routine ultrasound at a women's clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona. Billed to a credit card I didn't recognize, but linked to an address I now knew very well. Anne was pregnant. The timeline was simple arithmetic. 4 months along meant conception in June. June, when Harry had spent 2 weeks in Phoenix for what he'd called exploratory meetings with Southwest expansion partners. June, when I'd been recovering from a procedure that had ended my own chances of having a child that year. He told me it wasn't the right time. The company was at a critical juncture. We needed to focus on the business. We could try again next year. While I was healing, he was starting a family with someone else. I sat at the kitchen table with that invoice in my hand, and something inside me went very, very quiet. Marcus brought me more information the following week. He'd been digging carefully, covering his tracks, but he'd found something that made even his experienced face go pale. Harry had hired a divorce attorney. Not just any divorce attorney, Helen Marchetti, known in Charleston legal circles as the surgeon, for her ability to separate wealthy men from their equally wealthy wives with minimal collateral damage. To the men, anyway. The strategy documents Marcus had obtained, I didn't ask how, painted a clear picture. Harry was preparing to file for divorce, but he wasn't planning to leave empty-handed. The documents outlined a narrative. I had become increasingly unstable since my father's death. The stress of running the company had taken a toll on my mental health. I'd made erratic business decisions. I'd become paranoid, accusing my husband of imaginary betrayals. There were witness statements, colleagues who would testify to my concerning behavior, board members who had reservations about my leadership, and at the center of it all, Margaret, who would tearfully confirm that she'd watched her daughter's mental state deteriorate over the years. The goal was clear, not just to divorce me, but to declare me unfit to manage my own inheritance, to have me removed from the board of my father's company, to take everything Bobby Whitmore had built and hand it to a man who spent 6 years pretending to be a partner while positioning himself as a parasite. I read the documents twice, then I put them in my safe, and then I started making my own plans. They thought I was drowning. They didn't realize I was learning to breathe underwater. The scope of Harry's plan became clearer with each document Marcus uncovered. The divorce strategy was elaborate. Helen Marchetti specialized in what she delicately called complex asset restructuring. In practice, this meant helping wealthy clients separate from their spouses while keeping as much money on their side of the ledger. The approach in my case was particularly vicious. Step 1, establish a narrative of mental instability. This had been building for years, I now realized. Every time Harry expressed concern about my stress levels, every time Margaret suggested I take some time off, every dinner party where I'd been quietly excluded from business conversations, it was all building toward a portrait of a woman who couldn't handle her responsibilities. Step 2, document erratic behavior. I found records of incidents I barely remembered, a disagreement with a vendor that Harry had characterized as aggressive in an email to the board, a missed meeting that I was certain I'd never been told about, a purchase on my credit card for luxury items that turned out to be a donation to my mother's favorite charity. Each incident was minor on its own. Together, they painted a picture. Step 3, secure sympathetic witnesses. The list made my stomach turn. Board members I'd considered allies, colleagues I'd trusted, even my own housekeeper who'd been providing Margaret with weekly reports on my state of mind. Step 4, move assets beyond reach. This was where the shell companies came in. By the time the divorce was filed, Harry expected most of the company's liquid capital to be safely tucked away in accounts I couldn't touch. The property in Sedona was just the beginning. The final step was the most elegant. Position for control. Once I was declared unfit to manage my inheritance, someone would need to step in, someone with experience, someone the board trusted, someone who'd been quietly positioning himself as the steady hand during his wife's difficult period. Harry would divorce me, take my money, and inherit my father's company in the same set of legal maneuvers. It was almost impressive in a sociopathic way. But Harry had made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated his wife. I read through the documents one more time. Then I started making my own list, not of grievances or evidence or plans for confrontation, just a list of people. People who owed my father, people who remembered what loyalty meant, people who would help me when the time came. Looking back, that was the moment everything shifted. The board meeting in early December should have been routine. Quarterly review, budget projections, the usual parade of PowerPoints and financial forecasts that I'd sat through dozens of times before. But from the moment I walked into the conference room, I knew something was different. Harry was already there, which wasn't unusual, but so was Margaret, which was. And so were three men I didn't recognize, sitting at the far end of the table in matching charcoal suits. Attorneys. I could smell it on them. Harry smiled when I entered, that easy, confident smile that used to make me feel safe. Now it made my skin crawl. He said my name like we were meeting at a cocktail party, told me he was glad I was there, that we had some things to discuss. The meeting wasn't about quarterly numbers, it was about restructuring. Harry had prepared a presentation, professional slides, detailed organizational charts, a new vision for the Whitmore Hospitality Group that positioned him as CEO and me as nothing. My title would be Strategic Advisor, an honorary position, no operational authority, no financial oversight, no seat at the table where decisions were actually made. The board members watched me as Harry spoke. Some of them couldn't meet my eyes. Others studied me with the careful attention of people who'd already made their minds and were just waiting to see if I'd make a scene. I didn't. I sat in silence as my father's company was redrawn with me on the outside. I listened as Harry explained that this was best for everyone, and that I could focus on my health, and that the company needed steady leadership during this transitional period. Margaret smiled from the corner of the room, not a triumphant smile, she was too smart for that, just a small, satisfied curve of the lips, the smile of a woman watching a plan come together. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close. I walked out of that conference room with nothing, no title, no authority, no power to stop what was happening to everything my father had built. Harry caught up with me in the parking lot, tried to take my hands, told me this was really for the best, and that once things settled down, we could figure out our next chapter. I pulled my hand away without a word. That night, I found Margaret in our home, directing the housekeeper on which rooms to prepare for the transition. The older woman spoke about my future living arrangements as if she were discussing furniture placement. A smaller place would be more manageable, something in the suburbs, perhaps, away from the stress of the city. Harry arrived home to find them together. For the first time since our marriage, he didn't bother pretending. He talked about the divorce as a settled matter, about the paperwork that was already being drawn up, about how this would all be easier if I simply cooperated. I said nothing. I nodded in the right places, I let my shoulders slump and my eyes drop and my voice fade to a whisper. And when I finally climbed the stairs to the bedroom that would soon no longer be mine, Harry and Margaret exchanged looks of relief. The difficult part was over. The widow's daughter had finally accepted her fate. They didn't see my face once I turned away. He saw surrender. He should have seen the calm before the storm. The next morning, I woke early. I stood at the window of what would soon be someone else's bedroom and watched the sun rise over Charleston. The city looked the same as it always had. Cobblestone streets and historic facades and tourists already lining up for breakfast at the waterfront cafes. My father had loved this view. He'd stood at the same window when I was a child, pointing out the different boats in the harbor, telling me stories about the guests at his first little inn. This city gave us everything, he'd said once. We owe it our best work. I wondered what he'd think of what I was about to do. Harry found me there an hour later. He'd slept well, the sleep of a man who believed his problems were solved. He came up behind me and put his hands on my shoulders, a gesture that once would have felt like comfort and now felt like a warning. He said I was up early. I told him I couldn't sleep. He asked if I was thinking about the transition. I nodded, let him see what he wanted to see. He told me it was for the best, and there was something almost like genuine belief in his voice. He said I'd been carrying too much for too long, that my father would want me to take care of myself. I didn't trust myself to respond to that. I just nodded again. Harry kissed the top of my head and went to shower. A few minutes later, I heard him on the phone with someone, Margaret probably, or Anne, or one of his attorneys, making plans for the future he thought was already his. I stayed at the window until he left for the office. Then I picked up my own phone and made a call. I said 2 words, "It's time." On the other end of the line, Richard Whitmore started to laugh. The team came together in pieces. First was Marcus, the comptroller who'd spent 18 years protecting my father's legacy and now protecting mine. He worked at night after the offices emptied, documenting every irregular transfer, every shell company, every dollar Harry had siphoned from the Whitmore accounts. The paper trail was meticulous. Harry had been careful, but not careful enough. Second was Elena Vasquez. I'd found her through a contact at the Charleston County Bar, a family law attorney with a specialty in high net worth divorces and corporate asset protection. Elena had seen cases like this before: wealthy husbands who thought they could manipulate the system, wives who were supposed to disappear quietly. She took one look at my situation and smiled the smile of a woman who enjoyed her work. Third, and most important, was a phone call to Dallas. Richard Whitmore answered on the second ring. I hadn't spoken to my uncle in years, not since that brief congratulations call after my engagement with his cryptic warning about staying smart, but I remembered his voice. Calm, patient, the voice of a man who'd spent 50 years building an empire by knowing when to wait and when to strike. I didn't ask for help. That wasn't how Richard operated, and I knew it. Instead, I presented him with an opportunity. The Whitmore Hospitality Group was undervalued. Harry's mismanagement had suppressed the stock price. The properties were solid, the brand was respected, but the financials were a mess that only someone like Marcus could fully untangle. For a man like Richard, with his billions in Dallas real estate, his connections across the Southwest, it was a chance to acquire a significant stake in a company with real growth potential at a discount. All I needed was for him to buy my shares. Not all of them, just 20%, enough to combine with the 15% he already held and create a new controlling interest, enough to call a special board meeting, enough to undo everything Harry had spent 6 years building. The line was silent for a long moment after I finished my pitch. Richard finally spoke. He said Bobby always told him I was the smart one. Then he paused and said he was starting to think my father had underestimated me. The papers were signed in Dallas 3 days later. I told no one, not Marcus, not Elena, not anyone who might accidentally let something slip. I flew to Texas on a commercial flight, coach class, paying cash for my ticket. I met Richard in his office overlooking the Dallas skyline and signed documents that transferred 20% of my inheritance to a man I barely knew and trusted completely. When I flew back to Charleston that night, my phone showed 6 missed calls from Harry. He was checking in, he said in the voicemails, wondering where I was. I didn't call back. The next week passed in a strange kind of peace. Harry was busy with the transition. Margaret was busy redecorating the executive offices. The board members who'd voted against me were busy pretending they had no choice. None of them noticed that Marcus had stopped coming to the financial review meetings. None of them noticed that Elena Vasquez had filed a motion in family court, sealed by the judge until the appropriate time. None of them noticed that Richard Whitmore had requested a special session of the board of directors, citing his rights as a major shareholder to review concerns about corporate governance. I moved through those days like a ghost. I smiled when expected. I agreed when prompted. I let Harry believe he'd won. But at night, when the house was quiet and Harry was asleep with his phone face down on the nightstand, I sat in the dark and reviewed the timeline. December 15th, that was the date. The date Richard's board request would be processed, the date Elena's motion would be unsealed, the date everything would change. I looked at the ceiling of the bedroom I'd shared with this man for 6 years, counted the days, and waited. Harry thought he was removing me from the board. He didn't know I'd already sold him off it. The final piece came together in a conference room in Dallas 3 days before the board meeting that would change everything. I sat across from my uncle, the documents spread between us. 20% of my birthright, signed away to a man I'd met maybe half a dozen times in my entire life. It should have felt like loss, like giving up. Instead, it felt like loading a weapon. Richard reviewed the paperwork with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 50 years making deals that shaped cities. He didn't rush, didn't make small talk, just read every clause, every provision, every carefully worded contingency. Finally, he looked up. He told me my father would be proud, that this was exactly what Bobby would have done. My voice was steady, but something in my chest ached. I told him I wasn't sure about that Dad trusted people, that's why he let Harry in. Richard corrected me. He said Bobby trusted me, that my father trusted me to protect what he built, and that's exactly what I was doing. He signed the documents, I signed after him, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. But we weren't done yet. The next 2 days were a careful choreography of preparation. Elena Vasquez filed her motion with the family court, requesting an emergency freeze on marital assets pending investigation of financial misconduct. The motion was sealed. No one would know about it until the judge unsealed it at 9 a.m. on December 15th, exactly 1 hour before the board meeting was scheduled to begin. Marcus prepared a comprehensive report on Harry's financial irregularities. Every shell company, every diverted dollar, every payment to Ann Martinez's wellness retreat. The report was damning, meticulous, and irrefutable. Richard's team prepared the shareholder notification. As the owner of 35% of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, he had the right to request a special session to address governance concerns. The notification went out at 6 a.m. on December 15th, giving Harry approximately 4 hours to panic before he had to face the consequences. I prepared myself. I sat in my Dallas hotel room the night before, watching the lights of the city spread out below me like a constellation. Somewhere in Charleston, Harry was probably sleeping soundly, dreaming of the empire he was about to inherit. Margaret was probably reviewing her guest list for the celebration dinner she'd already planned. Anne was probably decorating a nursery, planning a future that depended on stolen money. None of them knew what was coming. My phone buzzed. A text from Harry. "Missing you. Can't wait to start our new chapter together." I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed a reply, "Me too." I sent it, then I turned off my phone, ordered room service, and went to bed. Tomorrow, everything would change. December 15th arrived cold and gray, with the threat of rain hanging over Charleston like a held breath. The board meeting was scheduled at 10 a.m. in the main conference room at Whitmore headquarters. Harry had asked me to attend, though I no longer had voting rights. A gesture of goodwill, he'd said, a chance to be part of the company's new chapter. I agreed. But I wasn't in Charleston at 10 a.m. I was in Dallas, sitting in Richard's office with a video feed of the conference room on a screen in front of me, watching. The board members filed in one by one. Harry took his seat at the head of the table, my father's seat, the one Bobby had occupied for 3 decades. Margaret sat against the wall, where she always did, pretending to be an observer while pulling every string in sight. The attorneys in their charcoal suits were there too, ready to finalize whatever documents needed finalizing, ready to make Harry's control permanent. At 10:05, the conference room door opened. Richard Whitmore walked in. I watched Harry's face on the screen, watched the confusion ripple across his features, followed by something that looked almost like fear. Richard had never attended a board meeting, not once in 30 years. His presence meant something was wrong. Richard apologized for the intrusion with his Texas drawl filling the room. Then he said he'd recently acquired a significant interest in this company, and he had some concerns he'd like to address. He produced a folder, thick, heavy with documentation. The next 45 minutes were a masterclass in corporate demolition. Richard laid out everything. The shell companies, the diverted funds, the LLC in Arizona that had received over $3.4 million in unauthorized transfers, the same LLC that owned a boutique wellness retreat in Sedona, a retreat operated by a woman named Ann Martinez, a woman who, Richard noted with devastating understatement, was expecting Harry's child. The board members' faces transformed as they listened. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock gave way to anger. Several of them turned to look at Harry, but he wasn't looking back. He was staring at the table, at the folder, at the evidence of his own destruction. Margaret tried to intervene. She stood up, her voice sharp, demanding to know what right Richard had to make these accusations. But Richard just smiled and produced another document. He announced that as of this morning, he held 35% of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, combined with the 30% still held by his niece, by me. That gave us controlling interest, and we'd like to propose some changes to the board's composition. Harry finally looked up. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. He asked if I had sold Richard my shares. His voice cracked on my name. Richard's smile didn't waver. He said not all of them, just enough. Harry tried to speak, to argue, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but every face he met looked away. Margaret stood up, her voice sharp, commanding, the voice of a woman who'd spent decades bending Charleston society to her will. She said this was absurd, that Richard couldn't just walk in and... Richard interrupted her, his voice mild, but his eyes cold. He said he could, that he was a 35% shareholder, and he had concerns about how this company had been managed. He produced another folder. This one was thicker than the first. Financial records, bank statements, wire transfers, a paper trail that led from the Whitmore Hospitality Group's accounts through a maze of shell companies and ended at a boutique wellness retreat in Sedona, Arizona. Richard explained that these documents showed systematic asset diversion over the past 3 years, approximately $4.2 million transferred to entities controlled by Mr. Thornton and subsequently invested in a property owned by his associate, Ms. Ann Martinez. The room was silent. Harry's face had gone from pale to gray. Richard continued. He said he had documentation suggesting that Mr. Thornton had been preparing to file for a divorce with his niece while simultaneously positioning himself to assume control of this company. The strategy involved characterizing Mrs. Thornton's as mentally unfit to manage her inheritance. He looked directly at Margaret. Richard added that this strategy appeared to have been developed with significant input from Mr. Thornton's mother. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The vote was swift. Harry was removed from his operational role immediately pending a full investigation into financial irregularities. His shares, the 8% he'd accumulated through the complicated vesting agreement he'd signed 6 years ago without reading carefully, were frozen. His access to company accounts was terminated before the meeting even ended. He tried to call me. I watched him do it on the video feed, watched him pull out his phone and dial, his fingers clumsy with panic. My phone was on Richard's desk, face up. Harry's name flashed on the screen. I didn't answer. He called again, and again, and again. Each missed call was a small victory. Each ignored voicemail was a brick in the wall I was building between my past and my future. By the time the board meeting adjourned, he'd called 11 times. The calls kept coming throughout the day. Harry left voicemails that started confused and grew increasingly desperate. He needed to talk to me. There had been a misunderstanding, if I would just let him explain. At 2:47 p.m., Elena Vasquez's motion was unsealed. Harry's assets were frozen pending investigation. His credit card stopped working. His access to the joint accounts was revoked. Everything he'd stolen, everything he'd hidden, everything he thought was safely beyond my reach, all of it was suddenly locked away. He called 12 more times between 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. By the time he realized I wasn't coming back to Charleston, he'd called 23 times. The 24th call was different. His voice had changed. The confusion was gone. The desperation was gone. What remained was something smaller, something broken. He said he knew I wasn't going to answer, that he knew he didn't deserve an answer, but he said my name. And then he said he was sorry. So sorry. He said he didn't expect me to believe that, didn't expect me to forgive him. He just needed me to know. I listened to the voicemail on speaker, sitting in Richard's office with the Dallas skyline glittering behind me. When it ended, I deleted it. Then I went to dinner with my uncle and ordered the most expensive wine on the menu. By the time I went to bed that night, Harry had called 30 times. I didn't answer any of them. Harry drove to Sedona 3 days later. The retreat looked different in December. The desert landscape was muted, browns and tans under a pale winter sky. The property itself was beautiful and had good taste, I had to admit. Clean lines and natural materials, and huge windows that framed the red rocks in the distance. Harry had paid for every bit of it, with money he'd stolen from me. Anne met him at the door, the property he'd funded with money stolen from me. She was showing now, her pregnancy visible beneath the flowing linen of her Arizona wardrobe. She looked at him without surprise. She'd been expecting this visit. She told him she'd seen the news. There wasn't sympathy in her voice, wasn't warmth, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact she'd already processed. Harry had practiced what he was going to say on the drive from the airport. He'd rehearsed his explanation, his apology, his plan for their future. He and Anne could still make this work. The retreat was in her name. The money was already invested. They could build something here, away from Charleston, away from the wreckage of his old life. But standing in front of her, the words dissolved. He asked if he could stay, just for a while, just until he figured things out. Anne's answer was quiet but firm. She appreciated everything he'd done for her business. She was grateful for his support during the pregnancy. But she'd built this life for herself and her daughter. She wasn't interested in building it with a man who'd just lost everything. He could see the baby, she said. He could be part of her life. But they wouldn't be a couple. They wouldn't be a family. She'd seen how he treated his wife, and she wasn't interested in becoming the next woman he tried to control. Harry started to protest, started to say he never. Anne interrupted him. She said he'd embezzled from his wife's company to fund her business, that he'd told her the money was clean, that he'd said it was from investments he'd made before his marriage, that he'd lied to her, just like he'd lied to me. She said she was keeping the property, that she'd earned it, even if the seed money was dirty, and she was keeping their daughter. She put a hand on her belly. But she wasn't keeping him. Harry stood in the doorway of the beautiful retreat he'd paid for and watched the mother of his child close the door in his face. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 6 years building a trap for me. In the end, he'd only caught himself. He'd spent years building an exit. He just didn't realize it was his own. Spring came early to Charleston that year. I stood at the window of my office, my father's old office, restored to its original arrangement, and watched the first boats of the tourist season making their way across the harbor. The city was waking up. The hotels were filling. The company was healing. The investigation into Harry's financial misconduct had concluded in February. The total amount diverted exceeded $4.2 million. Criminal charges were still pending, though the forensic accountant suggested it would be difficult to prove intent beyond civil liability. He'd been careful, just not careful enough. Marcus had received a promotion, Chief Financial Officer, a title that came with a corner office and a salary increase that made him blush when I told him. He'd earned it. Without his 18 years of quiet vigilance, none of this would have been possible. Elena Vasquez had become something like a friend. We had lunch once a month now, not to discuss legal strategy, but just to talk. Elena had a dark sense of humor and a wine collection that rivaled some of the Whitmore property's cellars. She'd also introduced me to a network of women who'd been through similar experiences, survivors, rebuilders, women who understood what it meant to lose everything and choose to keep going anyway. Richard had remained as chairman, but it was me who ran the company now, CEO of the Whitmore Hospitality Group, a title my father had always assumed I'd hold someday. I'd expanded into wellness tourism, a market I'd been researching for years, waiting for the right moment. The first acquisition was a boutique property in Sedona. Anne had sold me a minority stake in the retreat. A business decision, we'd both agreed, nothing personal. The property was performing well, and partnering with an established hospitality brand made sense for its growth trajectory. Anne remained as general manager. We communicated through lawyers and spreadsheets, and that suited us both fine. There was a certain politry to it. The retreat that Harry had funded with stolen money was now partially owned by the woman he'd stolen from. Every quarterly profit report was a small reminder of how thoroughly his plan had failed. Harry had returned to Charleston briefly to collect his belongings and finalize the divorce. He was thinner than I remembered, quieter. The confidence that had once drawn me to him was gone, replaced by something smaller and more desperate. He'd asked to meet, to talk, to explain. I declined. The last time I saw him was at the lawyer's office for the final signing. He tried to catch my eye across the conference table, tried to communicate something, remorse maybe, or the ghost of affection. I kept my gaze on the documents. When the divorce was final, I walked out of that office without looking back. He was working with Margaret now. They'd opened a small bed and breakfast in Savannah, nothing like the empire he'd almost controlled, but enough to keep the lights on. Margaret's connections in the old Southern hospitality circles had gotten them started, but those connections were fraying. Word had spread about what Harry had done. The industry was smaller than people realized, and it had a long memory. The bed and breakfast had 8 rooms. The Whitmore Hospitality Group had 12 properties and was in negotiations for 3 more. The contrast spoke for itself. His daughter was born in April, Olivia Ann Martinez. Harry drove to Sedona for the birth and stayed for 3 days. He had visitation rights, negotiated by lawyers, documented in court orders. He was allowed to be part of his daughter's life, just not the way he'd imagined. I learned about the birth through a news alert on my phone. I looked at the notification for a long moment, then swiped it away and returned to my work. Some mornings, I still think about those 3 words on the screen. She's having it. The moment my old life ended and my new one began. I don't regret any of it. Not the pain of discovery, not the months of careful planning, not the choice to fight instead of flee. My father had taught me that the hospitality business was about more than hotels. It was about understanding what people needed before they knew they needed it. Harry had needed to believe I was weak. I'd given him exactly what he needed. Now I was giving myself what I deserved. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, confirming the quarterly numbers. Revenue up, occupancy strong. The new Sedona partnership exceeding projections. Another text from Richard, just a photo of the Dallas skyline at sunset, with the caption, "Not a bad view from where I'm sitting." I smiled, typed a quick reply, then turned back to the window. The harbor was full now, boats cutting white lines through the blue water. Somewhere out there, my father had dreamed of building something that would last, something that would matter, something that would take care of the people who depended on it. I'm still building it. My phone lit up one more time, a message from a blocked number. Harry, still trying, still hoping, still believing that somewhere inside me there was still the grieving woman he'd met at my father's funeral, the woman who needed someone to take care of her. That woman is gone. She's been replaced by someone stronger, someone sharper, someone who learned that the most dangerous thing a person can do is underestimate a woman who's already lost everything she thought she needed. I deleted the message without reading it and went back to work. Some women wait for the storm to pass. I learned to reroute the weather. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories. See you next time.